On today's show, the Atlanta Hawks made an interesting bit of an overture to a free agent player. That player signed elsewhere, but what does it mean about Atlanta? All kinds of questions from you, the listener, about this topic and my own reporting over the weekend, and all of that's coming up right now.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to a bonus episode of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Saturday evening in late July. And today's podcast is brought to you by the folks at Gametime. Check out the folks at Gametime right now for all of the ticket needs that you might have and take all of the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the app right now, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase with Gametime. Check it out now today and download the app. Please go ahead also and subscribe to this podcast to make us your first listen each and every day here at Locked On Hawks. Check us out on Apple, on Spotify, also on YouTube, where you can like this episode as you are watching it, plus subscribing and enabling notifications on that platform. This is the second bonus episode in as many days. Now, this one's a little bit less urgent in some ways, but I had a little bit of time. I am traveling still. If you're watching this on YouTube, you probably know that at this stage. I did some reporting on Saturday that I shared on Twitter, and I felt like it was worth a little bit of a bonus episode over the weekend leading into Monday, and then I'll kind of get back on the normal grind with guests and things coming up. In fact, I should plug, if you missed it over the weekend, on Friday, I recorded a bonus/emergency pocket podcast talking about the EJ Liddell for David Roddy trade that was reported and then confirmed. As I'm recording this podcast on Saturday night, that deal has not been announced yet by Atlanta still, but that'll be coming in the coming days. Plus, I actually did a normal show on Friday talking about the depth chart on the Hawks, as well as some over-under stuff, etc. And please go ahead and subscribe, catch up on those episodes in recent days. So as I did on Friday, I'll be a little bit loose on today's podcast, a little bit shorter, but a pretty interesting topic that I reported on. So why in the world am I talking about Tyus Jones on a Hawks podcast? Well, the reason is there was a little bit of noise from me and others over the weekend. So long story short, on Saturday, Tyus Jones agreed to a contract with the Phoenix Suns, 1 year at his minimum. Now, it was not reported that way. It was 1 year at $3.3 million, but Tyus Jones' minimum is that figure. So one avenue here to sort of explore is I got a question from two different people, basically asking if this had anything to do with the David Roddy, EJ Liddell trade in which the Suns saved some money, and did the Hawks, quote unquote, help the Suns with this transaction? The answer to that is no. The Suns, because they are well over the second apron, this is kind of the nerd status of the NBA at this point in time, but they only can sign players to minimum contracts in free agency, and Tyus Jones signed for the veterans minimum. So that was going to be able to be happening no matter what. Did it help Matt Ishbia's wallet a little bit for the Hawks to have traded EJ Liddell for David Roddy? Yes, but as far as like basketball and roster is concerned, this had nothing to do with the other thing. It was just that the Suns could pay Tyus Jones this amount 2 days ago, and they paid him that amount on Saturday. With that said, that was not really the reason why I'm talking about this at this point. I reported over the weekend, basically on Saturday, that I had heard through the grapevine that the Hawks were actually in on Tyus Jones once the price dropped. That's a key ingredient here. So for some backdrop, Tyus Jones made $15 million or so per season over the last 2 years in Memphis and Washington. He made like $8 million a year before that in Memphis. Last season, he was the starting point guard for the Wizards, and every game that he played in, after he was basically what I would describe as the best backup point guard in the league in Memphis. He was overqualified to be Ja's backup in Memphis. Ended up actually starting a lot of games for them because Ja got hurt 2 years ago, but left for Washington. And last season, he was basically the best offensive player by EPM and some other metrics on the Wizards roster. He averaged 7.3 assists per game, which is pretty good, of course. He absolutely never turns the ball over. Just rock solid backup point guard. Shot it well from three last season. Not a huge usage guy, but averaged 12 points a game, like was very productive. 7 times as many assists as turnovers last year, which is ludicrous. And he's 28 years old. So he's in the prime of his career. And look, I'm sure Tyus Jones wants to be a starting point guard somewhere and in a big role. That's one of the reasons why he ended up going to Washington instead of Memphis, is that, that's a bigger role for him, all that stuff. That's important because, long story short, I would say Tyus Jones is kind of in no man's land, because why is he signing a deal on July 27th? Well, the reason is he's not quite good enough to be like the guy at point guard on a really good team. He's really good. Don't get me wrong. He's a good player. He's very solid. I appreciate his game quite a bit. He's not like a top 20 point guard in the league. He's like in that next tier down, which is fine. He would make a lot of teams better, including the Hawks, by the way, which we'll come back to in a second. But he's not good enough to be the guy. But he's also pretty much only a point guard. He's 6'1". His defensive numbers were really, really rough in Washington. And while that part of that's the Wizards, he's okay defensively, like maybe, but he's a point guard who's okay defensively. He's not going to be able to change your life. He's pretty small, etc. So I would say this: his best role on almost any team is backup point guard. And because of that, he's incredibly good in that role to the point where it kind of seems silly to have a guy who is that overqualified for the role on a team that has, for instance, Trae Young or another top tier point guard on it. So, all that said, that is part of the story here. I reported and then talked about a little bit after that yes, the Hawks were in on Tyus Jones. They made calls. They were at least talking. They have some stuff that they could have offered to Tyus Jones. But in the end, he goes to Phoenix on the minimum. And by the way, that's a great, great signing for the Suns because Tyus Jones is not a minimum player. He's well better than that. But what the Suns have that the Hawks don't have is a role. So yes, the Hawks could have played Tyus Jones 20 minutes a game. That's probably even more than he would have played in Atlanta. In Phoenix, he is currently the best point guard on the roster. They have Monty Morris, who I like as well. They do have guys who have played point guard in the past, like Devin Booker, Bradley Beal, who can be a little bit more on ball. But as far as point guard is concerned, like actually point guard, he's their best guy. And Phoenix is not, for me, a title contending team. They're good. They're not great. But if you're Tyus Jones and the money has dried up, which is obviously the case, he's been a free agent for 4 weeks and hasn't signed, which means that his market just wasn't there. And that is why, in some respects, as we'll get into in a second, the Hawks got into this on Tyus Jones. But once that's the case and the big money is not there for you, he even said this, he actually talked to Woj, who reported this and kind of gave this, not quite this plainly, but kind of said, look, I'd like to get back into free agency next year. And the best role for me to go ahead and do that and showcase myself is to be the best point guard on the Suns. Like that's the way he didn't say exactly that way. That's out there if you want to read the exact quote on ESPN from Woj. But if you're his agent, once the money's gone, if you're him, you want to be in a big role and have a chance to close games and maybe start some games, et cetera, et cetera. And tiebreaker wise, like maybe the Hawks could have offered more money and they could have, but in the end, he goes to Phoenix. So obviously, we'll get into kind of why this all happened because the number one question that I got after I reported the Hawks were interested in Tyus Jones is why? And people talking about Kobe Buffkin and Dyson Daniels and even Keaton Wallace, et cetera. So I'll get into that in a second, but I wanted to lay out kind of what happened here. The Hawks were interested. I don't just report things for no reason. I heard that a couple times. I'm not going to be someone who ever throws this stuff out there willy-nilly and tries to get clicks off of it. That's not what I do. But I did hear this, and I wanted to pass it along. Also, I wasn't alone. John Gabadoro, who actually works in Phoenix, it is very sourced up there, reported the Hawks were in on him as well. So it wasn't just my reporting. But with that said, that is what happened. I'm going to talk about why this might have happened in a second and answer those questions that you might have. But first, a word from our friends at Gametime. Today's show is brought to you by Gametime, an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. They help you get your baseball tickets and your basketball tickets faster and easier with last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seats, and the lowest possible price guarantee. That makes Gametime a fantastic option. It makes things easy for you across the board. I've been using the app at Gametime forever now, basically, and it has come in handy for me a lot when trying to buy tickets for the Braves, Falcons, Atlanta United, etc., as well as shows and concerts across the city. You can save big when buying last-minute tickets for sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. They have flash deals where you can save big money and save even more when you choose a section in a venue and let them choose the seats for you in that section at Gametime. They also have this awesome feature where you can toggle to show the total up front. No surprise fees when we get to the end. I love that feature. Also get a panoramic view of the seats in the app in the venue before you buy them. You know exactly what you're going to get into when you look at these seats ahead of time. And you're also getting the lowest possible price with the folks at Gametime. Take all of the guesswork out of buying tickets with the Gametime app. Download the app right now at Gametime and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, so before the break, I laid out what happened. Basically, the Hawks were calling on Tyus Jones, and they were the runner-up or maybe one of the runners-up for his services. Now, the second part. So I'll say this, very broadly speaking, why would the Hawks do this? Number one, he would help them. he is overqualified for the role. So coming into the offseason, like 4 weeks ago, I would not have put Tyus Jones on my radar. I did mention him very, very briefly as a free agent when I listed like a bunch of guys 4 or 5 weeks ago on this show, but I think I even said at the time, his market would have to be nil for him to come to Atlanta because obviously he understands that Trae Young is the point guard in Atlanta. And while he and Trae could play a little bit together, they're not suited very well to playing together because they're very small players and defensively it wouldn't be the best. Even if Jones can shoot it and that on offense it would work, on defense wouldn't be the best. So that's crucial to know that. If he had been making what he probably should be making, because look, I mentioned before what he made the last 2 years. I know John Hollinger did his like projection system coming into the summer. He projected him for like $14 million. Like that's what he's worth. I agree with that. In the modern landscape, like starter money, as I've been saying a lot recently, is like $22 million a year, something like that. I wouldn't pay him that, but like he's an overqualified, really good backup. So like he's like a seventh man, and that's what you make as a seventh man. There's like $12-14 million. So if that was the case, the Hawks wouldn't have been getting in on Tyus Jones. But weeks and weeks into the free agency, when the price has obviously come down, essentially he's overqualified, yes, but why wouldn't you call? Now, I've mentioned before on this show that I think the Hawks could have reasonably tapped another point guard. Dating back to like I talked about Colin Gillespie a few times. Like obviously that's not Tyus Jones. And yes, Keaton Wallace is on a two-way. Keaton Wallace is a guy that I like, but he isn't a proven entity. And I would have like been in the market for that like really boring third point guard who's just insurance. Doesn't have to play a lot. I mentioned Jordan McLaughlin at one point earlier this summer. And obviously Jones is a lot better than those guys, but they could use that guy for some safety because without DeJounte, yes, they have Kobe, but Kobe's unproven. We'll come back to that in a second. They have Dyson, but they don't have a guy on this team that is a proven NBA backup point guard. Or, I mean, obviously, besides Trae as a starter. So once the price came down, there's no reason not to call him. That's one factor. The second factor is the Hawks could have beaten the Suns' offer financially. Now, there's the tax argument, and I've laid this out a lot. No one believes, including me, that the Hawks are going to pay the tax this year. No one. With that said, they do have the ability right now to use the mid-level exception or part of it. I'm not saying they're going to use the whole thing. They weren't. But if they wanted to offer Tyus Jones more than the minimum, they could have done that. And that is, I think Gamadaro actually, who I mentioned before, reported even that Tyus, quote unquote, took less money from Phoenix than he would have from other teams. Maybe that includes Atlanta. And I think they probably did offer a little bit more than the minimum because the Hawks have to know if it's just the minimum, he's not signing in Atlanta. The only weapon they had against Phoenix would have been to give him another $1 million, give him another $2 million, whatever. And that would have caused some tax issues. Maybe that would have led to them moving on from Garrison Matthews, something like that. I'm not saying I don't know what would have happened there, but that was kind of the weapon the Hawks had in the negotiation against Phoenix. But again, it's clear why he picked Phoenix, which I led with that for a reason because the role there is way, way, way better. But the question I kept getting is why. Number one, he's a good player, right? Number two is it's not a slight at Kobe. Like I think it's pretty clear that I like Kobe Buffkin. I've been fairly high on Kobe Buffkin to this point. Kobe has not proven to be an NBA backup point guard. Now, I'm not saying that you don't want to play him because I think realistically, this Hawks team is not going to win the championship this year. So there should be a premium on some level placed on development for young players that they like. They like Kobe a lot. They wouldn't trade him different times the last year and a half. They drafted him in the first round. Quinn likes him. Everybody likes him. But beyond that, though, he's had some injury issues, of course. He missed Summer League. He missed a lot of last season. He's kind of a combo guard still. I still think Kobe's a point guard at the NBA level, but he's not proven to be that. And it's not crazy at all to bring in another guy. Again, Tyus Jones is better than what I thought the Hawks would have been targeting, but in late July, when a guy's good is available, you call that guy. So that's the reason why that happened, basically. So it is what it is on the Tyus Jones front. But I will just say this. Tyus Jones is qualified. So why wouldn't they pay him? It's one of those things. Going back to Kobe, I do think that it's more of an insurance thing. At the moment, I think Kobe is the backup point guard on the Hawks roster, and that is totally fine to me. I don't think they have to get somebody better than Kobe. Tyus Jones is better than Kobe right now. That's not what I'm saying they had to do, but he's available. The other thing that I've heard mentioned is Dyson Daniels. Like, the Hawks have so many point guards. They have so many guards. Well, they don't, number one. Yes, they have Kobe. Yes, they have Keaton Wallace. Dyson Daniels can play point guard, and he has at times, but I don't view him as a point guard. I don't view Dyson Daniels as that. By the way, I like Dyson a lot. I think people probably know that from listening to the show in reaction to the DeJounte Murray trade. I am quite high on Dyson Daniels. I also don't think of him as a point guard. Could he play there a little bit? Sure. Could he and Kobe play together? That makes some sense. Could he be on the court with Bogey as a backcourt where Bogey can handle the ball as well? Yes, but I don't view him as a backup point guard. So that's another thing. And also, here's the crucial part as well. Every time this happens over the summer, some fans, I'm not saying everybody, some fans they look at the depth chart and they say, why would the Hawks do this? Why would the Hawks do this? Why would the Hawks need this? They have so many player X. They have so many position X. And then you get into the season and people wonder why there's no depth. I think depth is underrated, basically, by a lot of people. One last time, Tyus Jones is overqualified for the role, which I've said 100 times on this podcast. But if they could get the 50% worse version of Tyus Jones for the minimum, still, I would be okay with them doing that because you want to play Kobe, but you also need to have a little bit of depth. Okay, let's just do this exercise for right now. Let's say Trey rolls an ankle and misses the first 2 weeks of the season. Would the Hawks be comfortable right now without Trae Young? I kind of think not. Could they get through the game? Sure they could. Kobe, I still think, is going to be a solid enough NBA guard as early as this season. Same thing with Daniels, who I like a lot. Different archetype, obviously. Bogey. Keaton Wallace is like an emergency guy. Perfectly fine as a two-way. But would anybody be super awesomely comfortable with this team right now sans Trae Young for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? Last year, Trae missed a lot of time. I don't think it's going to happen again, but it could. If you had someone like, again, the worst version of Tyus Jones, you'd be in better shape. So that's why you do this. That's why you make the call. But crucially, it's all about price point. It really is. If Tyus Jones was going to be getting $15 million a year, $12 million a year, $10 million a year, the Hawks would not have been doing that. But in late July, make the call, basically. That's kind of where as I said on Twitter, basically, it's like once he becomes that cheap, you just make the call out of obligation and you go on from there. So I understand that there's a lot of nuance to this conversation, and I'm looking at my Twitter. Even right now, people are like, why would they do this? They don't need Tyus Jones, blah, 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 blah. Okay. I'm not saying that, it's one of those things where it's not a huge, overwhelming need, but I've said it on the show before today. Like, in a perfect world, I think the Hawks could use another point guard and they could use another power forward who could shoot, basically. And I've said that on the show multiple times, well before this. Would I have named Tyus Jones? Probably not, because he's too good for that role. But his options were limited. The Hawks had the ability, the spending power to go ahead and make the call, make an offer to him. And I'll put it this way before I sign off this kind of pseudo bonus, whatever it's called podcast. If I had reported that the Hawks were signing Tyus Jones for 1 year and $5 million, what would your reaction have been? My reaction would have been incredible value for Atlanta. And I would have come on the show and said, look, there is only so many minutes he can play on this team. He and Trae are not a great fit together and all that. But if you said, what is the best way or what is a good way to have the Hawks be a lot better with Trae off the court, adding Tyus Jones for $5 million would have been a really, really good thing. And by the way, you probably could have traded him in January, February if you wanted to for value. That's the other part of this I at least should have mentioned. One reason why you make the call is that at that kind of price point, you sign him, you bring him in. He's a guy everybody likes, by the way, a guy who has really, really good reputation around the league. You work with him if you need to in January, February, and say, all right, Tyus, we're going to send you somewhere that you want to be, to a playoff team that's going to want you on that price, and the Hawks can get an asset for him, because on that contract, whether it's $5 million, $6 million, whatever it would have been, you could turn around and trade them for a positive return. So again, why wouldn't you make the call, even though Kobe Buffkin's there? And yes, one more time, I like Kobe Buffkin. I think Kobe Buffkin's going to be very good in the NBA, but it is simultaneously true that he's going to be good in the NBA and that he right now has very little experience at the NBA level, especially as a primary point guard. Because even last year, when he came up and played some of the NBA level at the end of the season, he was most of the time, like the vast majority of the time, playing with either Trae or DeJounte. They did not call Kobe's number as backup point guard last year. Number one, they didn't need to because they had other guys, but they kind of purposely made his responsibilities a little bit less. So between that, and I think people are just kind of penciling Dyson as a point guard, I wouldn't go there. I think he's more of a wing than he is a guard right now. So anyway, long rambling episode aside on a Saturday night. And at least wanted to pass that along to you. Number one, because I reported it. And number two, just because there's lots of interesting nuance on all sides of the conversation. Okay, that's all I have on today's shortened edition of the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe to this show anywhere you find podcasts, Apple, Spotify, etc. Please follow the show on YouTube as well. Go ahead and like this episode as you're watching it, plus subscribing, enabling notifications, etc. Please follow the show on Twitter at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there at BT Rowland. My written work is also available at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I did a little bit of salary cap math that I shared on Saturday on that platform as well. Check out the entire Locked On Podcast Network. And one more plug for the emergency pseudo show from yesterday on the trade of Liddell and Roddy. And then also on Friday, I did some sort of a normal episode before these two different bonus shows. So very busy time over the weekend. I will be getting home sometime on a Sunday, and I'll have more content for you going into next week. And once again, stay tuned all summer long for fresh content each and every week on this podcast. Thank you for listening. As always, I very much appreciate it, and we'll see you all next time.